Hi, I'm Pastor Michael Schmidt. Welcome back to Summer Bible Study. Today we will be covering the life of Abraham, which begins in Genesis chapter 12 and really goes into Genesis 24. That's kind of the death of Abraham in 24. So we're going to cover a lot of ground today. And some of you may remember that we actually did the life of Abraham in Bible study. And when you read the whole thing, there really is a lot. Abraham has a lot of experiences, a lot of sometimes things that we have generally forgotten, unless we go back and read them, of course. But today we will not be hitting every aspect of Abraham's life, but we'll kind of be hitting kind of the main details, just to give us an understanding of who Abraham is and why Abraham matters, why he is so important in the Gospels and in the history of Israel and even in the church today. Again, this Bible study is to introduce us or to lay a foundation so that when we hear Abraham mentioned in the sermon or in Bible study or just in conversation, there's something that comes to mind. Who is Abraham? Oh, Abraham's that guy that promises were made to, that very important aspect of the promise of a son. So that's kind of what we're looking for. We're trying to just give us a general overview of Abraham so that we have an understanding of him. So again, Abraham falls into an interesting... Abraham is kind of the reset on the world. The world was destroyed in the flood in Genesis 6 through 9. After the flood, they kind of keep doing what they were doing before. They were kind of all clumped together, not really spreading out and covering the earth. So we have the Tower of Babel incident in Genesis 11. Then God scatters the nations and confuses the language, which prompts them to scatter and sort of go out and fill the earth in a more the way he intended sense. So that kind of all happens, and then there is quite a bit of time. Just looking at the genealogy in chapter 11, starting in verse 10 through 26. There are quite a few people that come through there. And of course, the last one that we arrive at is... the descendants go all the way through Genesis from the chapter to verse 32 in chapter 11. But we do it is kind of a narrowing down. We're following the line of Shem, and this is his family line. And Shem lives to be quite an old man. In fact, Shem outlives Abraham by several years. Abraham kind of gets to about 100 or so, a little over 100. Somewhere in there, 120, somewhere in that neighborhood. Shem actually lives beyond Abraham. So that's kind of an amazing thing that we have someone who was on the ark still alive several hundred years after. It would be the equivalent of us today seeing someone from like the Revolutionary War or a Mayflower Pilgrim still walking around today. It's like, wow, you are so old. But you've seen so much. So that's kind of the context of Abraham. Abraham is a descendant of the line of Shem, and this is kind of the restart. God tries to... we start in Genesis 1 with Adam and Eve. There isn't really and then the next people we're introduced to are Cain, Abel, and Seth in Genesis 4. And the next individual that we really focus in on is Noah in chapter 6. So Abraham is the next one we're focusing in on, not as a global leader, but more as a family leader. That we're not going to work with the whole earth and everyone in it right now. We're going to work on this one family, that is Abraham. And we're going to build the line off of Abraham, build the faith off of Abraham. So that is the significance of Abraham. Abraham is, we're kind of zeroing in and focusing in on Abraham and his line, which will get us to Christ, who will be for all people, but we're not going to focus on all people at the moment. So God calls Abram. Abram is already, he's 75 when God calls him. Verse 4 says Abraham was 75 when God calls him. And so again, there's kind of this was not necessarily... So when we did our Bible study on Abraham, it's kind of Shem is kind of like Abraham's mentor throughout all this. That Shem is kind of watching over Abraham. Wouldn't say there's necessarily biblical evidence, maybe some extra biblical evidence to support that. But God calls Abraham, and the way we read it is it's a out of the blue call. Abraham is just sitting there one day, and all of a sudden God says, okay, pack your bags, go over there. And Abraham does it. But again, so Abraham is not... He's not faithful Abraham. This is not Genesis 22 Abraham. Genesis 12, Abram, in fact, not even Abraham, but Abram, is very rough, probably a pagan, at least to some degree. A clean slate is probably the best way to put it. He is a blank slate that God can work off of, that God can establish and build and form and mold going forward. He doesn't really have a background. In that case, he's a lot like, not even Saul. Saul becomes Paul in the book of Acts. And, prior to his conversion, Paul was very, very well trained and steeped in Judaism, particularly as a Pharisee. He knew the law and all that. So he had a background. He just kind of needed Jesus, and then the disciples to kind of put the pieces together in the right order, so that he saw the Old Testament as pointing to Christ. Abraham doesn't even have that. Obviously, he has family around him. He has the faithful line of Shem that's around him, but Abraham is still a blank slate that God can work off of. And we see that throughout Abraham's life when you really dig into it, is that sometimes Abraham does incredibly faithful things, and then sometimes Abraham does incredibly unfaithful things. When they go to Egypt and he tells Sarah to lie about who he is, tell him that I'm your brother, not your husband, so that they puts Sarah in a terrible position, but it saves Abraham's neck. So, and Abraham does that twice. So that's kind of the blank slate we're working off of. Is Abraham is, the edges need to be smoothed off and fixed over. But in chapter 12, we already have this blessing. Verse 2, I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So there's no promise of a son yet. That will come later. The main promise is in chapter 15. But here we already see the hints of what's going to happen. That Abraham, this random guy that God calls at 75 years of age, is going to be a blessing to the nations. And ultimately, Abraham will be a blessing to the nations. And those who bless him, God will bless, and those who curse him, God will curse, because of his connection to God and his role in the faith. So we see that all laid out here in the call in Genesis chapter 12. Again, Abraham is not an ideal candidate. Number one, he's too old. He's 75. That's not really what you're looking for when you are establishing or looking to take on new massive projects that will be for the have long effects is you're not really looking for the oldest guy you can find. Now, obviously, he's way younger than Shem, but 75 is really old. His prime childbearing years are behind him. And that will be a point of contention is Abraham says, I don't have any heirs. I don't have any sons. What's going to happen after I'm gone? So he's not the ideal because his faith, he does not have faith. And, he's way too old. He's got stuff. And he doesn't even have land. Whatever land he has, he walks away from. And he goes to Canaan where God tells him to. Okay, so this is, verse 7 is the first promise of the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So in an inhabited land, there are other people living there in the land at that time. God says, see all this land that you don't own any of, and actually will never own any of for your entire life. I'm going to give it to you. You can have it. So we see the foundations of the promise right here in Genesis chapter 12 at the call. You'll be a great nation. Your name will be blessed. And look at all this land I'm going to give you. So you can see that there are great things in store for Abraham. And, whereas today, if you make a grand promise, if a sports team says, I make a grand promise that we're going to be better this year than we were last year. And it's like, well, the fans think, okay, we're going to win the World Series. We're going to win the Super Bowl, the NBA championship. We're going to win. And really, you're just like, you win 2 more games this year than you did last year. So the owner, the president, whoever can say, we were better than we were last year. And the fans are like, well, we kind of were expecting something more. So Abraham, instead of making the promises more narrow, God actually makes the promises more broad and more difficult to accomplish to show his glory that I'm going to accomplish all these things. All right, so Abraham is called in chapter 12. In chapter 15, God comes back to Abram and he sort of tightens up the promise, makes it more specific, gives more details. So chapter 15 starts with, verse 2 and 3. Abraham says, I have no heir. If I drop dead right now, Eliezer, my servant, gets everything. And God says, the promise here is then to Abraham. It's a threefold promise. We'll start with verse 12. As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abraham. Behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. Then the Lord said to Abraham, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs. Will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years, talking about the Egypt and Exodus. Bring judgment. You'll leave there with great possessions. Okay, here it is. Verse 18. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, and the land of the Canaanites, Kenizzites, Kadonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaim, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites. Where is the promise? Okay, well, the promise in chapter 15 is in verse 5. He brought him outside and said, look toward the heaven and number the stars, if you were able to number them. And he said, so shall your offspring be. So there's the promise there of many descendants. Abraham will have many, many descendants. Obviously, when Abraham dies, he has one. Well, I guess technically 3, because Isaac would have had Jacob and Esau by then. When they go into Egypt at the end of Genesis, their number is 70. When they come out of Egypt, they are, a great multitude. And then when they settle the land, well, then particularly when we get to Solomon, and the offer of ask anything you want, and Solomon says, this people is too great for me to govern. How am I to govern them? So we say that Israel's population does grow quite a bit from 1. But even in the church today, the family tree of Abraham continues to grow because we are all grafted into the line of Abraham. That you and I are descendants of Abraham by faith today. So the promise here in chapter 15 is, a son, many descendants, land, and then there's also the promises, I will make your name great, you shall be a blessing. So this is the kind of the reestablishment of the covenant with Abraham, the forming of the covenant, that I will give you a son, I promise you a son. So the immediate son is, of course, Isaac. And then the greater son of Abraham will be Christ, who comes obviously much later. Again, kind of here in chapter 16 is then kind of the birth of Ishmael. Kind of another example of Abraham is faithful, but he keeps trying to help God. God's never looking for a shortcut, but Abraham is always looking for a shortcut. Abraham is always looking for a way to help God out. So obviously he and Sarah are too old to have children. So he says, well, I'll have a child with Hagar, my servant. She's young. And he does have a son, but that son will not be the heir. Okay, so, chapter 17, the birth of Isaac is promised again. Chapter 18, we do have, Abraham. This is the pinnacle. This is the good side of Abraham's faith. The pinnacle of Abraham's faith is Abraham is arguing on behalf of Sodom. For the sake of 50, for the sake of 40, for the sake of 30, for the sake of 20, for the sake of 10, will you destroy them? And God kind of shows mercy all the way down to 10. God is saying, for the sake of 10, I will not destroy them. So Abraham has this relationship with God that kind of no one else really has. Well, I guess Moses does have it. Moses has this close, special relationship with God where God says, that's it, I'm going to destroy all the people. And Moses says, no, don't do it. You promised. So a very rare relationship where God's servants, Abraham, Moses, can argue back and forth with God and have that special relationship with him. And of course, chapter 19, Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed. Lot is rescued. So that is of course, another highlight in the life of Abraham is that, we've kind of got the two storylines competing here. We have Abraham over here, and he is learning what it is to be faithful to God. And then Lot's over here kind of doing his own thing, almost falling further and further away from God. Lot is always, at least sometimes, Abraham makes the right decision. Lot almost never makes the right decision. Earlier, chapter 13, I think, they come to the point and there are too many cattle, too many sheep, and they say, we need to separate. And Lot says, well, there's a town over there with flashing lights and whatever. I'm going over there. And so Lot goes over there. Lot kind of makes a home in Sodom, and it's kind of like, why would you do that? Why would you want to move there and live there? So Lot is kind of running the opposite line of Abraham. Abraham is constantly, bailing Lot out, but Lot is not the pinnacle of faith that Abraham is. All right. Chapter 21, Isaac is born, so we finally do have the fulfillment of that promise of a son. that we have the assurance that, okay, here is a son. He will carry on the line. He will fulfill and make known the promises that are, he will live to see the fulfillment of promises that are made to Abraham. They kind of stay nomads throughout Genesis, but Isaac is at least the fulfillment of that promise. Genesis 22 is the height of Abraham's faith. Abraham is never more faithful than he is right here. Genesis 12, Abraham could not do this. Now, granted, Genesis 12, Abraham does pack his bags and leave his home and his family and go to a land he has never heard of because God told him to. That is a very faithful thing to do. That's a very difficult thing to do, and God bless Abraham for doing that and carrying that out. Genesis 22, Abraham is kind of a whole nother ball game, because God tells Abraham, take your son, your only son whom you love, and take him up on the mountain and sacrifice him. And the question always is, why does God tell Abraham to do this? This seems absurd. Why would you ever tell your son, your servant, to do this? It was so hard getting a son. Now you're going to tell him to kill that son. What's wrong with you? And this goes to show us, what does God want from his people? Is the people, later in the Old Testament, the people think God only wants sacrifices. That if we keep making sacrifices to God, God will be happy. And in the book of Amos, God says, stop making sacrifices because they are a stench in my nostrils. Your sacrifices stink, is what God tells the people. So he doesn't want sacrifices. Sacrifices are an example of a faithful heart. But if there is no faith in that heart, then the sacrifices are a waste of time. The same with offerings, the same with gifts. The same with, the temple is a great and glorious thing built to the glory of God for the worship of God. But when the people are not using it in the right faith and in the right way, and they are, mocking God, and the temple just sort of falls apart, it's like, well, who cares if the temple's destroyed because you're not using it anyway. Abraham finally got what he wanted. Is God promised Abraham a son. Abraham said, okay, God, I'll do whatever you want, just give me a son. Abraham finally gets the son. Now what? Because now that Abraham has the son, is Abraham going to remain faithful to God? That is the main question in Genesis 22. Abraham, where does your heart lie? So anytime we discuss this passage, everyone says, oh, I could never do that. I could never take my son or daughter and sacrifice them. I could never hold the knife over their head, ready to plunge it into their chest cavity and kill them on the spot. I could never slit their throat. I could never click their artery. I could never kill them. I could never do what Abraham did. And you know what? Killing your son or child is a very difficult thing to do. And that is a tall task, and Abraham is to be commended for his faith. But God is coming to you today and saying, okay, you don't have to sacrifice your kids. What happens when God says, quit your job and be faithful to me? Quit your job that is causing you to break the law or do immoral things or miss worship on a regular basis, and come and quit your job. That's what you have to sacrifice on the altar. Sacrifice your job. Sacrifice your phone. Sacrifice your money, your house, your property. Are we willing to give these things up? What is the number one priority in your life? This is first commandment stuff here. Abraham's not being asked to do anything ridiculous or absurd. Abraham's being asked to keep the first commandment. You shall have no other gods. What does this mean? We should fear, love, and trust in God above all things. What's all things? We should fear, love, and trust in God above our children, our jobs, our property, our stuff, our phones, whatever. That is what God is asking Abraham to do. You wanted this child. You got the child. Now, who do you love more? The child or the Lord God of heaven and earth? That's the question put to Abraham. That's the question put to you and I today. Would you put your phone on the altar and take a hammer and smash it and ruin it? Would you take your job and put it on the altar and quit? Would you sell your house? Would you walk away from your lifestyle and live a much more humble lifestyle, a much more frugal lifestyle for the faith? Because God matters that much. Because God does matter that much. Now, we like our stuff. I like my stuff. You like your stuff. That's why we have it. If we didn't like it, it'd be on eBay, or it'd be on a yard sale, or it'd be at a donation center. It would be someplace else. If we didn't love it, we wouldn't have it. So look around and say, do you love your stuff more than you love the Lord God of heaven and earth? And if the answer is yes, you love your stuff more, then you need to sacrifice it. You need to get rid of it. You need to destroy it. So the key example here of Abraham, the lesson to take away from Abraham, is Abraham's faith. Abraham's living out of the first commandment. That Abraham loves God more than he loves his son. Now think about that, because in the Gospels, Jesus tells us, that the gospel of Jesus Christ, crucified, died, risen again, will cause division in families. Who do you love more? Do you want to keep those relationships with your children, with your spouse, with your family, even though they are forsaking and condemning and cursing God at every turn, or do you want to remain faithful? Because sometimes you might have to shake the dust off your feet and walk away even from family because of their rejection of the word of the Lord. That they are a toxic environment preventing you from worshiping and loving the Lord. Or they're just trying to draw you away from the faith. We talk about Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses and Muslims are very strict about this. That, if you reject the faith, the Mormon, Jehovah's Witness, or Muslim faith, they will shun you. They will never speak to you again. If you convert to Christianity or any other religion from Mormonism or Jehovah's Witness or Islam, they will never speak to you again. So that's the threat. Are you convinced enough that you believe in Jesus Christ enough that you are willing to give up family, friends, and home? Because Abraham says yes. He believes enough that if God does not stop him, he is willing to drive that knife into the chest cavity of Isaac and kill him. That is the lesson to take from Abraham here. Genesis 22 also points us to Christ. There are numerous parallels here between Abraham and Isaac and Christ. Obviously, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love. Jesus is God's own beloved son. God's only son, his beloved son. Isaac carries the wood. Christ carries the cross. Lay down on the altar. The ram caught in the thicket is the replacement, is the replacement for Isaac. Christ is the replacement for us. We belong on the altar. We belong on the cross, and yet Christ is the substitute for us. Genesis 22 then kind of wraps up. There's a reaffirmation of the promise. Because you have been faithful, I will remain with you. I will surely, verse 17, I will surely bless you and multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and sand of the sea. Your offspring shall possess the gate of the enemies. So kind of that promise is reaffirmed and reimagined and reiterated to Abraham. Sarah dies in chapter 23. Chapter 24, Isaac needs a wife. Where are we going to find a wife? Then Genesis 25 is the death of Abraham. So Abraham lives a long life. Let's see, what's Abraham's final year? Died of old age. 175 years old, so I was quite a bit off. Abraham dies at 175. So again, not the 900 that Noah lives to, and not the Shem lives quite to the old age as well. Up there, maybe six. I think Shem might die at 600 or so. But Abraham dies at 175, and we see that going forward is that they don't really live that long after. Excuse me, after the flood. And so Abraham, this is kind of the new normal. In fact, even today we would say Abraham lives well beyond normal than we do today. So that is kind of the wrap-up of the Abraham story. So we see that the story of Abraham is the story of learning the faith, growing in the faith, almost like this is Abraham's confirmation class. That Abraham comes to faith, is kind of wobbly, shaky in the beginning, and then grows in the faith throughout. And then ultimately, is very faithful in that he does this amazing thing in the faith in Genesis 22. But this is the beginnings of, kind of the beginning of the rest of the Old Testament. Is that what matters throughout the rest of the Old Testament, and especially in the Gospels for the Pharisees, is can you trace your lineage back to Abraham? Abraham is the father of the faith, the founder of the faith. And it's all about getting back to Abraham to show your purity, to show your worthiness, that I am a child of Abraham, I matter. And, what does that mean for... That's kind of your key in the faith, is that you're not saved through grace, you're saved through Abraham. That if you get, this is throughout the Old Testament, genealogies are very important in the Old Testament and Judaism because genealogies get you back to somebody or something. And in the scriptures especially, it's getting back to Abraham. Can we get back to Abraham? How do we get back to Abraham?